If you've played League of Legends in the past year, 2 years, or really ever since Season 2, you've probably run into at least one player complaining about how the tank meta is breaking the game. If you haven't, well, buckle up, that's what I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes. So it's been ages since the competitive norm has been something other than just picking the tankiest characters top lane, taking teleport, and AFK farming until late game. Just watch literally any LCS match of any region and see who they're playing top lane. The variety you see is going to be whether you get to see the exciting gameplay of Nautilus, or Maokai, or Shen, or Poppy, the most thrilling champions in all of League of Legends. Even some of the off-meta picks that you see are mostly going to be things like Singed, champions who are a lot more interesting, but are more tanks. It takes literally the most overpowered fighters introduced to the game to be even in consideration for playing something else, champions who, of course, are going to be nerfed in the next patch. Seriously, the variety that you see in something like LCS has been so non-existent for the past 4 years, I get on my knees and praise God every time we get to see something like Fiora, but to be fair, there is a reason why these champions are the ones you see being played nonstop. They're really good. Tanks have been ridiculously strong and, more importantly, safe picks in League of Legends for a really long time, which has created this spooky tank meta consisting of invincible champions that are, well, invincible, but somehow not only take 0 damage, but are also simultaneously the champions that deal the most damage in team fights and the most damage on the enemy team. I would honestly say the tank meta is the #1 thing that kills fun in League of Legends. Anytime a Poppy or Maokai or anyone like that becomes overpowered, they actually break the game in a way that pretty much no other champion can. Now hold on there, G-Bay, you're probably saying to yourself, that's a little bit ludicrous. Every role has its OP champions, and top lane isn't some special case. Even entire classes have been broken before. That's why we just had the whole assassin rework, right? What makes top lane so different? Well, I'm glad you asked. Tanks are a much different situation than any other OP champion or role of the past, but to explain it to you, I'll need to segue nicely into a little history of the role and just how tanks got their way into League of Legends. The idea of specific characters being in a party simply to soak up damage originated in the early 90s from the popular multi-user dungeons at the time, or MUDs. MUDs were the early version of MMOs, so let's talk about MMOs here since this isn't all that interesting to look at. Class-based MMOs in particular are a great example of tanks being used in an effective way. When you're PvEing a boss monster that can kill an uncoordinated party in an instant, it's useful to have a specific character that's able to draw aggro and tank its damage with massive health pools and abilities to help him survive its onslaught of attacks. However, there is one key important component when it comes to being a good tank, and that is making sure the boss is actually attacking you. If you can't keep whatever it is that you're trying to tank attacking you, then all of your tankiness will just go to waste. That's why it's pretty important to know how to draw and keep aggro, which is why there's a million guides for tanking in every MMO on YouTube. I mean, you can even see this in League of Legends. Whenever you're doing Dragon or Baron, it's important to make sure that when you're playing someone like Ahri, who's a squishy carry mid lane and isn't supposed to be tanking Baron, you aren't the one that pulls aggro and takes 2 unnecessary shots from Baron and ends up getting yourself killed and losing Baron for everyone on the team. This is the problem you have when you bring a class like a tank into a PvP situation like a MOBA, because even though you build all these tanky items and become an unkillable monster in the same way that you would in an MMO, you're up against actual human beings that kind of have brains, so you can't guarantee that they'll attack you, and again, if they aren't attacking you, your untouchable health and resistances will just go to waste. So tanks have to pose some sort of threat to an enemy team to force them to deal with whatever it is they bring to the table, and there's generally 3 ways a developer like Riot can handle this. The first way is by giving the tanks a taunt, a crowd control ability that will physically force a champion to attack the tank. These are used sparingly and are typically just another form of CC in League of Legends. Since taunts only last a couple of seconds, Riot can't give some crazy 6-second taunt or something, because then we'd be Dota. The second way is to just give a number of CC abilities or disables to a single character. Think about someone like Malphite. With a massive knock-up engage, an auto-attack speed slow, and a normal slow, you have so many annoying disables that you have to watch out for, and this makes Malphite a really frustrating presence in a teamfight where you have to play around him. If you simply ignore him, well, bam, he'll set up for his team to ace you no problem. The third thing that Riot can do is generally where we run into problems, and that is Riot could give some of these tanks a little bit of damage. If you give tanks just a tiny amount of DPS and a few abilities that adds up over time, then that will force people to deal with them. They can't just ignore them, since their AD carry or whatever squishy carry they have will be killed over time. And honestly, when you put it like this, it doesn't sound so bad, right? but holy shit, this is the worst idea of all time. When you combine a little bit of damage with a lot of tankiness, you create these unkillable beasts that not only never die, but because they're effectively invincible, they actually outdamage you in 1v1s. All they need to do is drag out a fight a little while since you can't touch their health bar, and they'll eventually kill you after a couple of rotations of spells. Does it matter if the tank is 0-3 coming out of laning phase, you may ask? No, because currently tanks need 1, maybe 2 items, and they can 1v1 any carry no matter how fed they are. This is why I think the tank meta is 100 times worse and more needing of a rework than anything like what happened with assassins. You see, assassins were a problem because they would deal a crazy amount of damage, one-shotting your health bar in literally the blink of an eye, where Riot had to go and fix that by giving Rengar immunity to CC. But even before the rework, there was already a little bit of counterplay to assassins in that you could punish them for mispositioning. If you had good vision and caught an assassin out as he was trying to flank your team, or maybe you stunned him if he mispositioned in a team fight, they were really squishy characters, so you could punish these goofy little mistakes. It wasn't the best form of counterplay out there, but at least it was something. But tanks don't even have that. If you ever see a tank on their own, you can't kill them. They'll just start a fight and wait for their team to show up. They're supposed to be the ones getting focused and attacked, so you don't even have the luxury of being able to kill them off quickly if they misposition in a fight. They're tanks. There's no such thing as mispositioning. All of this added together creates a real problem that's not only frustrating to play against, but it effectively makes every other top laner useless as well. Let's take a look at the different kinds of champions you can throw top lane for a moment. Riot actually has a little guide that shows the classes and subclasses champions are put into, but I think this is a little misleading when it comes to champions being played in specific roles. For instance, Evelynn and Diana are both classified as divers, but I would argue something like Evelynn jungle is played a whole lot differently than something like Diana mid lane. Plus, some of these categorizations seem a little bit far-fetched. I mean, they did put Poppy and Maokai in the defensive doesn't deal any damage kind of tanks. So allow me to redefine them a bit. When it comes to top lane, there's generally 3 different kinds of champions you see being played: hybrid bruisers, juggernauts, and tanks. The hybrids are my personal favorite class, champions who are much less tanky than the other two, but who are supposed to deal the most damage and have the most movement. They serve as a hybrid class combining tanky bruisers and carries, a hybrid between the two, and these are your Aurelias, Jaxes, Fioras, Camille's. Even stuff like Kennen or Rumble could be thrown into this category when you're talking about their top lane gameplay. All you really got to think about though is these are the champions who deal the most damage but are the least tanky. Next up are the Juggernauts. Juggernauts are an odd subclass that consists of very tanky champions, but champions who also deal a lot of damage. They don't typically deal quite as much damage as the hybrid fighters because they're sort of balanced out by having a lot of their damage be conditional. Like you have to get setups, like Yorick for instance is a Juggernaut. He needs to set up his ghouls and his ultimate if he wants the most DPS possible, and he has a huge drop off if he doesn't. Or Darius, who needs to get 5 stacks of his passive before ulting. Because their damage is a little more conditional, Juggernauts generally deal a little less DPS or less sustained damage at least than hybrids, but they're much more tanky because of it. And then finally are the tanks, the champions like Poppy, Malphite, Maokai, Nautilus, Sion, and Shen. These are the champions who are supposed to deal the least amount of damage than all the previously mentioned characters while being the most tanky and difficult to kill. However, a problem comes up. When you give all these champions a little bit of damage and incredibly tough tank stats, they actually effectively deal damage that's pretty close to the other two roles. If tanks are ever dealing similar damage to the other two roles but are much more tanky, why on earth would you ever pick champions top lane who are hybrids or juggernauts? It just kills the meta of playable characters top. Not to mention, a lot of these tanks also have a lot of movement abilities to serve as an engage as well. I mean, talk about an overloaded kit. They constantly blow up any squishy character they jump on. Just look at these cherry pick games I played recently. I was dealing the most damage or close to it on the team. How is this not against the law? Now, to be fair, I am glossing over some details here in the blind rage that I have against these champions. For instance, a lot of why they've been popular in pro play top lane isn't just because they're so good, but it's because a lot of these champions have abilities that are incredibly good in coordinated teams. Like a Shen ultimate, for instance, is an insanely good ability to have in competitive play where you're all on voice comms talking stuff through and not having to rely on your top laner to have a modicum of map awareness. On top of that, these champions are incredibly difficult to punish mistakes on. You can't just gank a tank to shut them down. All a tank really is CC that's built into the kit, damage, which mostly comes from flat base stats, and the tankiness that comes from 1 or 2 items. Killing a tank doesn't do too much other than maybe delaying his 1 item in the early game, so you really can't punish one if he makes mistakes, not warding or overextending, whereas if you pick a hybrid or a juggernaut top lane, you actually get punished for dying. Why would you play a champion where dying matters in the LCS? Another thing I should mention is a lot of the problem tanks that have dominated League in the past, causing the situations that break the game that I'm describing, have eventually been nerfed. Poppy, for instance, seems a lot more reasonable after her recent nerf, and Maokai and the other tanks have been nerfed in the past if they get too out of hand. Plus, there is a little bit of counterplay to tanks which I'm neglecting to mention. If you pick one of the juggernauts or hybrids top lane against a tank, you can generally go for kills in the early game, and if you get some, you can snowball a lead to pretty ridiculous levels where the tank certainly can't kill you or has a hard time hardly farming to get his crazy good items. But at the end of the day, this meta of picking non-stop tanks has really made League of Legends pretty boring top lane. Riot seems aware of this issue and is talking about potential fixes. Just a few days ago, they released a dev blog talking about the state of champions, specifically the state of Warwick, assassins, and tanks, and they say their current project is actually a tank class update, specifically working on the Vanguard subclass, which, again... But to be fair, Riot does say in this post how they are aware that tanks are the easiest, most simple, and one-dimensional pieces of garbage in the game, and how they want to make them more skill-oriented. I hope they follow through with this promise, but until then, oh my god, someone save us from this nightmare.